Ross Ulbricht is serving a double life sentence without parole for all nonviolent charges for creating a website. Please help free this peaceful man. Go to freeross.org and sign and share the petition.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dissecting Liberty podcast. Today, we are joined by our first returning guest, the Politicrat.
Hello. Good to be back.
Yeah, good to have you, man. And today, we're going to be talking about the social contract. So, Cotton, if you want to go ahead and get us started with that.
Well, there are, from a historical standpoint, there are three main theories. That's like the Hobbesian theory, the Lockean theory, and the Rousseauian theory. And we talked a bit about that in a recent episode on the origins of the state, but we did not get into it nearly as much as we maybe should have. Not necessarily for that episode, but because it is a really interesting topic and it has a lot of its presence is felt in modern day governance very heavily, in my opinion.
For sure.
So I thought that this would be a good deep dive topic to go into, which is why we asked the Politicrat to come back on. So why don't you give us the ins and outs as you understand them for the social contract?
Yeah, so the social contract, I'm sure all the listeners know this, of course, but it's essentially the deal. I don't know if that's the best way to describe it, but sort of like this unspoken kind of agreement between the people of or the body social and the body politic, essentially. So it's an agreement between them. It's essentially, in short, that the body politic will protect the body social, but the body social has to submit before the body politic and allow the body politic essentially to intervene in their affairs in case something goes wrong. So I mean, in theory, it sounds pretty good, but then again, you have the state, and you know how they essentially just keep legislating themselves more and more power, and then it's you get to a point where pretty much arbitrary and illegitimate. So that is the one that is the main problem with the social contract, because the state is the one with all the power in the end. So what is to stop it from overstepping what the ethos of the social contract was originally supposed to be?
That's a big problem. And that is basically, as I understand it, that's basically why Locke wrote his second treatise. Because instead of, he thought that the point of a government was to protect certain things, certain innate things, life, liberty, property, and not to encroach upon other things. He believed it was to give negative freedom rather than positive freedom. But in an application, it's almost always used as a positive freedom arm.
And that really began with Rawls.
Yeah.
Back in so basically what I see with Rawls, with him, he almost combined Rousseau's social contract with Locke's in a sense. So he had the property rights aspect of Locke, but then he had the positive quote unquote liberty of Rousseau. So I mean, I do think Rawls's version of the contract is better than Rousseau's, not by much, but yeah. I mean that's pretty much our modern understanding of the social contract, at least how it's kind of practiced in modern liberal democracies, is essentially the theory of Rawls. When he, I think Theory of Justice was the book
Yeah.
that he proposed in it, and Robert Nozick, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, was written like as a response to Theory of Justice, because Rawls essentially thought that the role of the government is to, I don't want to say maximize happiness, because he wasn't a utilitarian, but it was essentially to facilitate justice, to distribute justice, to be involved, to kind of like uplift people, help them actively, and there's like people will be happier if ultimately the government comes and does that. Whereas then you had Nozick, who he didn't necessarily believe in the social contract, but he kind of did implicitly, just in sort of like he's like, oh, it's going to sort itself out essentially. But his whole thing was like, no, people are going to be happier if they're just left the fuck alone.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know if you remember this, but we had like a conversation on our Discord a while ago about Hobbes and his formulation.
Mhm.
And you said that like that, I don't know the exact wording you said. Like you might have said that was like the most understandable or the most true.
Well, yeah, just from a realist perspective,
Yeah.
yeah. Like, I mean, it's definitely like so I don't separate, like when I think of it, I mean, I know a lot of people do, but when I think of the social contract, I only see two versions really. There's the Rousseauian version and the classical liberal version. And I don't see Hobbes and Locke as having two different interpretations of the social contract. I more so see Locke as improving upon Hobbes's. So like Hobbes came up with like the base idea of it, and then Locke is like, okay, let me just refine this and make it a little more like democratic or individualist, essentially. Because I mean, by today's standpoint, Hobbes can come across as a bit authoritarian, but it's also good to remember he was like the first like classical libertarianish guy. Like, I mean, these ideas, like there would be no Milton Friedman, there'd be no Murray Rothbard if it weren't for Hobbes.
Yeah. And this is kind of a side note, but Leviathan is kind of up there with like the King James Bible just for affecting our language. Like it's an incredibly beautifully written book.
It's great. Like that was actually, I believe that was like the first work of political philosophy I ever read. Leviathan. This must have been back, oh god, sophomore year of high school maybe, because I remember there was because I went to a private school. It was like formerly a Catholic school, but my freshman year when I was there, it was like the year after it transitioned, which was a terrible mistake because they lost so much. They lost so many students and pretty much went bankrupt because of that. But so we had these like seminars that we had to take. It was still left over from like when it was a Catholic school. So the first one was studying the Bible, just like an analysis and going through it. And then the second one was like a comparative religions one. And I remember, so one of the best teachers I ever had, Mr. Brown, he just graduated from had a theology master's or something from UVA. He was late 20s, and so he took a liking to me, and so we were all watching this documentary on Islam one day because it was part of the curriculum, and like everyone hated it. It was just so boring, and it just seemed very very biased, but like biased in favor of like Islam. Like, I mean, it was kind of hilariously condescending, I remember. But so everyone was bored, and then after class he pulled me aside and was like, hey Jacob, this is kind of bullshit, right? And he's like, hey, how about we just start doing let's just do a philosophy class. We'll start with oh god, I forgot who we started. We started with like the pre Socratic philosophers, classical Greece. And then by the time we got to Hobbes, that's really where it got interesting. And that's basically when I really started shaping that really started getting me to think about my political views. Because I remember at the time, I was kind of basically my political views just depended upon the people I was around. So when I was with conservatives, I agreed with them. And when I was around more liberal people, I agreed with that. I guess I was just kind of a liberal by default, but who had a couple conservative ideas. But then basically the first thing I became in terms of I guess the label I would use to describe myself in hindsight, probably a center-left Hobbesian.
Yeah.
So I was kind of a statist, honestly. At that point, that was basically when I was oh yeah, ideal government would be the Galactic Empire from Star Wars, and I unironically believed that. And that was when I was for. I wasn't I was skeptical of socialism, and I always have been, but I was for a welfare state. I remember.
Well, I think a lot of us had sympathies like that early on.
Yeah, because I actually, unlike, a lot of people have come to where we are. Most seem to have come to where we are from the right, whereas I feel I'm one of the people in the minority who came from the left.
I think that's definitely true. More people, because I think on the right,
It's the economic stuff. It's easier
Yeah.
to sway them with the economic stuff.
And then the other thing is just if you're a GOP right, and then you're all about preserving the Constitution and small government. Eventually,
well, they say that, at least that's what they say. That they say that, but
yeah. Well, that's the thing. I think the people that genuinely believe that, but they're GOP type Republicans, either eventually wise up and think, oh, the Republicans aren't actually doing this. There must be another way. Or there's a massive amount of cognitive dissonance going on.
I feel honestly, okay, so I'm just going to outright say this, but I have never been more disappointed in a politician in my life than I am with Rand Paul.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, he was his first term as senator. He was really good, defending whistleblowers, good on civil liberties against the drone strikes, and even teamed up. He was even had a bromance with Cory Booker. They did a lot of prison reform stuff together, and tried to legalize marijuana, just all that civil liberties related stuff, ending, I think, trying to stuff having to do with the war in Afghanistan, reducing troops. Of course, their efforts did not pan out because we all know how that is. But but yeah, no, I just think I think that the GOP in a lot of ways has finally fulfilled itself, and this is and basically the Trump movement, because the Trump movement is going to still be around after Trump, but I think that is going to be the final congealed expression of the GOP before it dies.
Yeah. And then, something similar is going on with the Democrats right now.
Oh yeah. No,
because...
okay, so this is so I actually have I always had this idea for an evil plan, how to infiltrate the Democratic Party and turn it back into a Grover Cleveland style Democratic Party. Basically, so you have the far left and the corporate quote unquote centrists right now, basically locked in a civil war. And so basically, I just think you should get a lot of civil libertarian centrists, old school liberals, blue dog people, classical liberals, some libertarians, or just sort of make a coalition and then all team up and then just Zerg rush the Democratic Party and co-opt it from the establishment.
I don't know. I don't see that happening.
Though there is, there actually, believe it or not, there's a Democratic Liberty Caucus or Freedom Caucus or something. I mean, it's yeah. No, I mean it's like and apparently they had like people in local offices and stuff, but it's not very popular now. But there was the current governor of Colorado was when he just got elected, like I think a year or two ago. When he was in the House, he was like the sole Democrat who was part of the Liberty Caucus with Justin Amash, Thomas Massey, Ron Paul back in 2012.
Well, I have a question, and
yeah, we're kind of going off.
To get us back on
Yeah.
topic here. Can you describe how Hobbes describes the state of nature in his book, The Leviathan?
So Hobbes described the state of nature as inherently violent, and so he kind of took a Machiavellian approach in a sense, because I mean, yeah, like in terms of like a lot of the ideas of modern political philosophy, that goes back even farther, past Hobbes, back to Machiavelli and even to Aquinas. But yeah, so he took a very kind of a realist approach, and was essentially like in nature, the physically strong are always going to triumph over the weak. Hierarchy is inevitable. You see it everywhere. I mean, which is true. Hierarchy is inevitable whether you like it or not. You see it even in the games of children. But so Hobbes was basically like, in order to maintain social order, what needs to happen is there needs to be a strong central force that essentially has the capacity or the infrastructure to be able to keep people from killing each other, essentially, and ultimately that would make society more civilized. But the thing is, he still believed in dynastic monarchy, essentially. So he was like a proto-liberal. So this was before Locke. So, but he believed in like property rights and stuff. But so he was like, yeah, that they should be able to, or the state should be able to use the full extent of its power in order to keep the peace. So he was very specific about the idea. But if you think about like his social contract theory, it was just like the raw concept of it. It's not really something that can necessarily be applied today, but it was a necessary step in order to proceed to Locke and then to like Jefferson and Mill and those guys. But so yeah, with Hobbes, it was about state of nature is inherently violent, and that's why you need a state. And then with Locke, it was more people. He was he was a little vague when it came to the state of nature, but he was a little less cynical when it came to that. He was like, he thinks people are generally good, or not necessarily good, but like the tabula rasa, blank slate, not inherently evil, but and then as people discover things and learn about the way things are, people will eventually come together and realize, in order to constrain the forces of nature, we need to form the social contract. So essentially the social contract is completely enforced in Hobbes's theory, whereas it is a mutual agreement in Locke's theory, where essentially you have the people coming together, and then they create a government, and they essentially their coming together is what legitimizes the state. So the state doesn't legitimize itself, but they legislate they legislate power to an elite, to like an elected elite, who will then protect them in turn. And so it's kind of a symbiotic thing. So yeah, so like I said, like I think I see it as Locke more building off of Hobbes, because there would have been no Locke if there weren't a Hobbes.
Now, Cotton, before we started recording, you were talking about you had a professor that was actually very Hobbesian. And
well, he was saying that, and he said this in his Locke lecture, but he said that trade cannot really happen in a state of nature because there's too much insecurity. So the argument for social contract is to have the state that can make things more secure and can protect trade so that people can save money, and that's why we need a government. And I was thinking, I was holding my tongue at the time, but I'm thinking business began in the state of nature. Like it began without a central guiding force uh, giving mandated insurance to those tradesmen.
But then you also have to, because there are different theories about how the state forms, and I think that they're both right to an extent. But there's the idea, there's like the Lockean view that it's essentially a social construct in terms of people deliberately end up creating the state. And then there's the Hobbesian view where it's completely organic, where slowly over time the state forms. Like society might start out kind of like voluntary at first, and there's really no government, but eventually an elite will rise and that will form the government. And that's actually my main criticism of, so I like as a thought experiment, I do like Rothbardian anarcho-capitalism. However, I know you guys definitely disagree with me here, but I just don't think it is feasible, because in the absence of the state, what is there to stop? There's nothing to stop the state from forming. And it doesn't necessarily have to form in the same way that the state exists now. Like, you had Max Weber, who said he defined the state as whatever institution has the monopoly on violence. So what if you have like a Acme Corporation or something starts, I don't know, like buying up all these other companies and ends up essentially creating this giant like business corporate infrastructure. But even though it kind of looks like a normal business at first, it eventually starts to function like an oligarchy. And then they eventually end up controlling all of the business in like a specific area. And it's like, is it even a company anymore? Or are we back to square one? And let's say like they build like some kind of private defense force. I know this is like a very extreme example, but more of a hypothetical. I just think at this current level of civilization that we are at, there's nothing whatsoever to prevent some kind of state-ish type thing from forming, whether it is in the form of like a government that we have, or if it's in the form of some kind of like corporatist oligarchy, which isn't even capital. It wouldn't even be capitalism at that point. And then what gets me though is like when you have like anarcho-syndicalists and ANCOMs saying, "Oh yeah, no, everybody's just gonna like be be communist and stuff, and everyone's gonna be happy, and we can come together in communities," and that's not government. It's like, no, they're literally advocating. If they're advocating for democracy, they're advocating for government, because democracy is inherently a system of government.
So in response to what you were saying about like a private corporation essentially becoming the state, I don't think that a society could become a libertarian utopia, or not that exists or will ever exist, but like an ideal libertarian society without a majority of the people having liberty as their primary value. And if that were the case, then Walmart would not be able to transition from a private corporation to a state entity,
pseudo state,
right?
probably.
Because they're still
technically a corporation,
right, and they're still being affected by market dynamics. So
I don't know, I've always liked the idea of the market and the state coexisting, but to keep one another in check. Because the thing is, the only too much, because the thing is, if you have too much democracy, you destroy democracy. And if you have, I don't want to say too much capital, but in a way, if you have too much capitalism, that can sometimes end up destroying capitalism too. Because sometimes the worst enemies of capitalism are the capitalists. Look at the people who are lobbying for regulations in order to prevent startup companies from forming, and cornering the market, lobbying for monopoly rights, that whole thing. Like a Silicon Valley right now, in a way. So I consider myself essentially a quasi-fair capitalist, as opposed to 100% unregulated, because I do think that may have the potential to lead to some negative externalities. And I just say that from almost like a realist perspective, because and I guess I'm going to go a little Hobbesian here right now, but there are those people in life that are going to try to take power and use whatever kind of agency that they have in order to screw over other people. There are always going to be those people in the world. And I feel like if there's sort of nothing, there needs to be some kind of apparatus in order to prevent that from happening, not necessarily to completely regulate the the marketplace, but just to prevent people from taking advantage of that sort of thing. So I guess kind of like Friedman and Hayek. So I'm definitely my view is definitely not like Rothbard's, but kind of more like Friedman or Hayek, who are free market is good. However, you have to take into account that there are sometimes going to be unforeseen negative externalities. But I guess I'm a little cynical when it comes to the future of the market and government and that sort of thing, because I almost feel like even if we try to work towards kind of a freer society, I feel like at this point it's inevitable that that the lines between state and in corporate power, the lines are going to start they're going to start thinning, and it's going to start fading, and then they'll essentially merge, and then that'll lead to essentially Caesarism. So where you have these strongmen populists who are really rich, essentially, and so sort of Julius Caesar, or the other guy in the triumvirate who ended up getting killed by the Persians. I forget what his name is, but yeah, no, but you're going to end up getting those figures kind of rise up, and it's essentially just going to be the rule of money, but there's going to be no distinction between that and the state. So think of what China's right now, almost.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree. I do think one of the most important things is having guns, because that changes things a little bit. But I don't necessarily disagree with your pessimistic view entirely. But back on the social contract topic, why don't you tell us a little bit about Rousseau and his formulation?
Yeah, so Rousseau wrote a book literally called The Social Contract. And so it wasn't in the Hobbes-Lockean tradition, because like I said, at least I view Locke as being sort of like an expansion pack to Hobbes, essentially. But yeah,
that's understandable.
the thing is, Rousseau took it in a completely radical direction. So he basically took the concept, but he made something entirely different, where he essentially, it was basically a sequel to his discourse on inequality, but he was almost basically Rousseau was almost like a proto-socialist. Definitely was in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But
yeah, in our episode about the origins of the state, I described him as a anarcho-syndicalist.
yeah, I'd say that's probably a good description of him. Because the thing is, what's interesting is, so he considered himself like a classical liberal, but I guess this is before all of these schools of thought diverged, but yet he was also, he kind of had a love-hate relationship with private property. in a lot of ways. But
Yeah.
but his whole thing was essentially that he rejected, well, because like so you have Locke, who is for constitutional monarchy and believed that there needs to be sort of a give and a take between the king, the parliament, and the people, and that's why he was the person who came up with the idea for a bicameral legislature and 3 branches of government. That's all Locke. And then Rousseau was like, no, he was more so like, we need to essentially, basically the concept of the abolition of unjust hierarchy begins with Rousseau. Because he's like, we need to abolish dynastic monarchy altogether. Well, not even dynastic monarchy, all kinds of monarchies. So, I mean, France at the time was a dynastic monarchy. It wasn't a constitutional monarchy like the UK was. But so I mean, it makes sense why he would be so against it. But his whole thing was no divine right of kings, and divine right of kings is kind of stupid anyway. But he was like, no, get rid of the divine right of kings, and the people themselves who are sovereign. Only they have the right to rule. So he was very utopian in that regard. So he was almost like the halfway point between Locke and Marx, I guess. He'd be like if Locke and Marx had a baby.
Yeah. I was reading his discourse recently, and I have read the Communist Manifesto. I've never read any of Das Kapital, but
No, it's a very Das Kapital. I don't know. I feel like Das Kapital is really pretentious. I couldn't get through it. No, but honestly, okay, so I actually kind of like the Communist Manifesto. It's actually kind of fun to read, and it's fun to read. Honestly, like he's like, I mean, in theory, what he says makes sense, but the thing is, in practice, it doesn't work. But that's why I don't like. I mean, I feel like people vilify Marx so much because he created communism. But the thing was, if Marx were alive today, he probably wouldn't be a communist because communism had not been tried. Therefore, they had no empirical case study to show that communism does not work. And he was just coming up with he just came up with an idea essentially.
Yeah.
Plus, I also get the point that modern Marxists have never even read Marx.
Yeah.
Because the thing is,
they read it from Tumblr blogs, bro.
No, because the thing is, Marx didn't even really hate capitalism. There was an entire chapter where he was praising the innovation that capitalism brought. And then I think this is the biggest problem. When you have the far left, and then you have just every capitalist in general, which could be everywhere from left of center to Austrian school anarchists, just in general. But the thing is, the word capitalism, they always argue over capitalism usually. You see it on Twitter all the time, and it's just a shit show. But the thing is, I just realized the word capitalism gets lost in translation when they're having those arguments, because the thing is, people like us, we mean something completely different when we say capitalism than what the far left does. The far left, the thing is, how Marx defined capitalism, he did not define capitalism as a free market system. He defined capitalism in the same exact way as Adam Smith, who was an influence on Marx. His definition of capitalism was the exact same thing as Marx's definition of mercantilism. So Marx was not criticizing economic liberalism. He was criticizing essentially, basically the British East India Company type quote unquote capitalism. You know what I mean?
Yeah, he was. It sounds like he's just more anti-fascist.
Yeah, essentially. And he was also, I remember there was this, it was kind of funny. I remember I was seeing a meme, and it was Marx, it was a picture of Marx next to a picture of Reagan, and it was a quote of Reagan advocating for gun control. And then it was a quote of Marx saying that the individual needs to be able to arm himself against the elite if they come and attack. I'm like, that's based.
Yeah. Well, and then like you said that Marx wasn't necessarily against capitalism, and that's true. He just saw like socialism as the next step. You know, it wasn't necessarily that capitalism was like a wrong turn or something that like a lot of modern day Marxists think, but he just thinks it was another step along the way.
He wasn't even calling for a revolution. He was just saying there's going to be a revolution.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah.
But the
honestly,
reason I like the Communist Manifesto is because it's so honest. Or like, you know,
is.
nowadays communists will say, no, we don't want to get married. We don't want to get rid of religion. But in the Communist Manifesto, he outright says, you know, no religion, no marriage. And it just gives you a very
Did he say no marriage?
pretty sure.
But I've honestly, so I have a kind of a theory on Marx. I've actually always seen him as, well, with the exception of the religion aspect, I've actually always seen Marx as more of a reactionary than a revolutionary. Because if you notice, his main criticisms of capitalism have to do with how he thinks it breeds degeneracy, essentially, and how materialism breeds degeneracy, and about how he talks a lot about moral decay, essentially.
Yeah, that's the Rousseauian influence there.
Yeah, like, so, I mean, he was just, yeah. And so almost his whole thing was do a revolution in order to, because like he wanted a moralist, like puritanical society. And that's actually why I think in a lot of ways Marxism is almost the secularization of Calvinism. In a lot of ways. Because I mean, if you look at like the Puritans in 17th century England, like their whole thing, very egalitarian, like hyper egalitarian, very austere, and that was essentially like what Marx wanted.
I'm pretty sure I could easily be misremembering or thinking of something else. But I have gotten heat for praising the Communist Manifesto on this podcast before, for just saying how honest it is.
Really?
Yeah. Well, hey, you know, I hang out with degenerates like Liberty Zero here. What do I expect? You know?
I didn't criticize you for that.
Okay. Sure. But yeah.
I criticize you for a lot, but that was not one of those things.
Okay, fine. So one more question and then we'll wrap up.
Okay.
Who do you think out of those three philosophers, who do you think had the most realistic version of the social contract?
Okay, so in theory, I like Locke's. However, as a realist, I think Hobbes's analysis of human nature makes more sense. But John Locke's his application works better. Like John Locke's system works better, but Hobbes was more right in terms of like just basic analysis. But I do think the one thing, like, I mean, I do think that the state of nature is inherently violent, but not necessarily because everyone is a terrible person, but more so because you have those few terrible people who are just going to go and trample on everyone, and that's what makes it chaotic. But I feel that if there is going to be a social contract, it should be executed in the same way that Lux was, because the thing is, the one thing about actually really positive aspect of democracy is that, at least, I mean, in theory, it is a way of keeping the elite accountable. I mean, maybe not so much these days, but in theory, that's what it is.
Yeah.
But yeah, but I do think that Locke was definitely right when it came to tabula rasa, blank slate, where we develop our worldviews and our morality based upon our observations as we're growing up, essentially. and we sort of come to these conclusions. Like, basically, if you see somebody murder somebody and you witness that, you'll be like, oh shit, that's bad. Like, I mean, that's kind of like a universal kind of concept. But yeah, I will say though that, or actually, I'm going to ask you a question real quick. What are your guys' opinions on the French Revolution?
On the
On the
French
French-
Revolution?
Yeah, was it a success or was it a failure?
Okay, I'll say I think it was a failure because they weren't as organized as they could have been, and it left room for strong men like Napoleon to take control.
Yeah, so we
Where
had I think it was so you had Robespierre. It was funny. So like basically the Jacobins were basically just like, originally they were basically ANCAPs without the NAP,
yeah,
and but then after that, then they became like proto-Keynesians after they took charge, and they completely invalidated their worldview because they were for like an egalitarian system. But once they took over, they became the new elite. Kind of like I don't know if you guys have read James Burnham, his any of his works, where he was a former Trotskyist, and then I think he became like a conservative essentially back in like the 50s. But yeah, he essentially wrote about a lot of that stuff. But I think so. Yeah, the French Revolution, in my opinion, is definitely a failure. But I think the one positive aspect it had is that it completely ended up delegitimizing the divine right of kings, not just in France, but all across Europe, because then people started saying, look what happened. This is complete bullshit. We need to reform. So I think at least the French Revolution ended up prompting most of the other European polities at the time to at least create like a constitution, essentially.
yeah. What do you think, Zero?
Well, I mean, it gave us the guillotine, so it wasn't all bad. No, I mean, I am far from um, I'm far from an expert or even well informed on the French Revolution, but just from everything I've heard, I tend to agree with the two of you. The focus on egalitarianism that you see, like, I definitely disagree with that. And yeah, just you really can't go around killing everyone that uh, you don't like. That's that's
Yeah,
not a good way to structure a society.
and I don't usually like talking like this, but I think part of the problem was with the French Revolution was the French, because they're
The
just
French
like,
Enlightenment kind of sucked.
yeah, like
The only
in their
good one,
character, they're just
the
too
only good
utopian.
I like Montesquieu and Voltaire. That's it. The rest of them suck.
Yeah, I like Voltaire is one of my favorites. I really like Voltaire.
Good. Yeah, because in a lot of ways, Voltaire and Montesquieu, even though they're part of the French Enlightenment, in terms of what their beliefs, they were a lot closer to the English Enlightenment.
Yeah, I don't know that much about Montesquieu, but I know Voltaire spent quite a bit of time in England during the Great Revolution,
Oh yeah,
so that makes sense.
yeah, and then but yeah, but yeah, French Revolution, total shit show.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Well,
like I was reading Edmund Burke. I'd never read Burke before, and he was like making really good arguments like about how there are certain institutions that are inherently fundamental for a civilization to properly function, and like there are just some things that you cannot destroy because some institutions are the pillars of society. And so that's why I think reformation and incrementalism just works a lot better than revolution.
Yeah.
yeah. I think once you get rid of marriage and religion, everything goes to hell.
Yeah, it's in a lot of ways. So like I mean I think that I don't think that necessarily you have to be like religious to be moral, but I do kind of understand that a lot of our moral conceptions do primordially derive from a religious tradition. So like in a lot of ways you see like So I've never so I used to see the Enlightenment as a revolt against religion and the creation of this new ideal, like this new kind of like literal ideal. But after reading some stuff more, like just reading more stuff over time, I've actually come to the conclusion that it was the rationalization of the Christian feeling of progress, because you have the concept of progress, which is essentially rooted in Christianity, and the Enlightenment, they took that and then they just made it, they rationalized it, and it became secular. It became secularized. So it was the same values, but without the theology. But then you started having people who started attacking the Enlightenment, and in a way, that's pretty much the same thing as attacking the religious foundation too, because the Enlightenment is the actualization of the of religion's influence in a lot of ways.
You cut out quite a bit there, but what I caught was that the Enlightenment was not necessarily an attack against Christianity or
It wasn't
religion,
a
but
revolt. Yeah, not even with Rousseau, because Rousseau like converted to Catholicism, I remember. But yeah, no. So I've never seen the Enlightenment as a revolt against, or I used to actually, but after doing some reading and really looking more into it, I've come to the conclusion that it was actually more of the it was the fulfillment of religion in a lot of ways. It was the rationalization of the Christian feeling of progress in a lot of ways. Is like the concept of progress is inherently rooted within like the Christian theology initially. Like the concept of progress is an inherently Western concept. But so yeah, in a lot of ways, religion evolved and then the Enlightenment came about. But then you have people like these days now who are attacking the values of the Enlightenment. And in a lot of ways, it's like that's the same thing as essentially attacking the values of like certain religious values, because the Enlightenment was essentially just the secularization of those same religious values, because it all derived from that. So
yeah, I don't disagree with you. This would be a good book topic.
yeah, I am. So I do talk about this in the book that I'm writing right now. About just like I'm writing a book right now about like social cycles and the rise and fall of different like cultures throughout human history, essentially, and about how similar things happen. But that is something for another day. That is a completely different topic.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's wrap up. Why don't you plug anything you want to plug right now?
So if you guys want to follow me on social media, I am the Politicrat. I had my old account, which had like 2K followers, but I ended up getting banned for insulting the foreign minister or something of the People's Republic of China. Yeah, so now it's not the Politicrat on Twitter. Now it is the PO capital I, or yeah, ITI something. There's the Politicrat. I have no idea why I can't spell it right now. But yeah, I don't know. But yeah, so yeah, that would be PO capital I, or then I again. TOCRAT.
On this episode of Dissecting Liberty, we tried desperately to spell.
Yes. I'm probably better at grammar than I am at spelling.
Here, me too. I'm the exact same way.
Spelling is hard.
And we'll link all of that to the show notes.
All right, man. We appreciated you coming on and having this discussion with us.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me back on.
All right. Well, wrapping it up, I am Liberty Zero, reminding you to zero your rifle.
And I'm Cotton Archist, reminding you to pick your cotton voluntarily.